If food waste would be a country, it would be the third largest climate polluter on the planet. If you remember the Arab Spring, the trigger that actually made it happen was an explosion in food prices. 60% of all the reasons why we have to distribute humanitarian aid is caused by conflict. So we see that more and more humanitarian workers become a target themselves, and humanitarian convoys, clearly marked as humanitarian aid, are suddenly being attacked. African countries very much depending on the world market, but way too little trading going on between African countries.
This is Moving Europe podcast, where we bring to you a European perspective on topics that matter.
And if you like our content, then please don't forget to like and subscribe.
The world produces food which can feed about 10 billion people, in theory. The practice and the reality is that around 700 million people suffer from hunger every day. That's around 1 of 11. Why this is and what we can do against it, we will discuss today with our guest Martin Frick, who is director at the UN World Food Programme. Thanks a lot, Martin, for being here today.
My pleasure, hello.
You have been working at the UN for many decades in different positions. What is it that motivates you from day to day, and what is it that you believe in?
Well, I've been with the UN now for 11 years. Before that, I was a German diplomat, but I think the motivation is just this fascinating world of international collaboration, which is the most beautiful thing if it works and the most frustrating thing if it doesn't work. And what I have been doing in the time with the United Nations was always circling around fighting food insecurity, fighting poverty, but also fighting climate change and environmental degradation. And these things go together. I find it fascinating, and I think that here is maybe the biggest option that we have in what is a very difficult situation for humanity.
So you really see these topics interlinked: climate change on the one hand, food security, cooperation. It's all one of a bigger picture.
It absolutely is. And the fascinating thing about it is that, if you look from a perspective of humanitarian aid or development, there is a group of about 1 billion people that we think we need to look after. But the reality is that I believe these people hold the key for the future of this planet if we get it right. And the interface where to get it right is food.
And maybe one more question on this. To which degree do you think that the West has to intervene to help people in need? And to which degree do you think it's actually also about staying out where we should not intervene too much?
That's a complicated question. I mean, in humanitarian aid, it's about saving lives. There is no ideological discussion whether you should be doing this or you should not be doing that. When people are dying, when people are starving, you have to help. How we do it best in the long run is a different decision and a different discussion. And the more you zoom into these questions, the more complex it gets. But in the end, I think there are a couple of truths that really do apply.
And considering the beginning of the statement of this podcast that we produce enough food in practice to everyone, but then what is happening is that we have hundreds of millions still living in hunger. You mentioned that, of course, it's very complex. The reality is more complex than the theory. But if you could explain to the audience, like in the most direct way possible, why we don't manage to give enough food to everyone?
Well, couple of questions and couple of reasons. Let me start with rich countries. Rich countries such as, Germany, where we are now, typically waste almost 40% of their food. It simply is there in the supermarkets, it's at home, it's not being eaten. That is not only a waste of resources, but it also, if you see that much of the food production is actually very energy intensive, it's an incredible waste of energy and rotting food is actually also a source of methane emissions. So it is producing greenhouse gas emissions and a factor in climate change. In fact, it is so big that if food waste would be a country, it would be the third largest climate polluter on the planet. It's crazy. So people get this and they know it from their own experience. But where I believe it gets even more incredible is that in the world's poorest country, you basically have the same number of food waste like in rich countries. Now, how can that be? How can that be that you have countries where people are starving and there is food waste? The reason is not that people are wasting food, but the reason is that often the most simple infrastructure to bring the harvests to the family is not there. So there is no drying, there is no smoking, there is no cold chain, there is no canning. There sometimes are not even usable roads. So you produce food, it grows, the harvest is there, and you can't bring it to the people.
So we miss the means to deliver this food.
The basic technology really to bring food to where people live, and particularly, high quality food, fresh fruit, for example, fresh vegetable, they are delicate. You need to handle them rapidly, you need to handle them professionally, and there's only so much time to bring them to the market. Think about fish. Fish is in need to be cooled because in a hot climate, within hours it's perished. And that is something where you can definitely address one issue of that paradoxon that 10 billion people could eat, and we have 735 million who chronically don't have enough to eat.
Yeah, and here, since you have decades of experience indeed with the UN, the World Food Program, can you mention one very positive impact in regard, for example, to deliver food that you still remember, that for you was a big satisfaction?
Oh, totally. I have my pet project in the UN, and you see it here at the wall. This is basically in the Sahel, which is that belt between the Sahara Desert and the tropical belt on the African continent, where there is rainfall. It's not a lot of rainfall, but it is possible to actually do agriculture. And yet, large areas were lost for agricultural production. And we have been reactivating an old technology where we know this is at least 2,000 years old, by which farming ladies, and it's mostly ladies, are digging half moons, little trenches that just capture the rainwater when there is precipitation. And in the middle of it, you actually plant a local species of a tree. The water infiltrates, it stays long enough, the tree can grow, and in the shadow of the tree you got the ground temperature going down 4 to 6 degrees, humidity is going up, and slowly you can start doing agriculture in the shadow of these trees. And the results are amazing. If I would show you the same picture 3 years later, it is lush and green, and there's even streams of water in periods of extended droughts. For me, this is the way to go.
And it seems like something which can be done without too many resources, right? It's basically rediscovering a technology which has been there in the past and bringing it again to the people who may have lost it, or if I understood correctly.
Absolutely. The technology is simple, but you need to take into consideration that this takes a couple of years before actually the results are there. And that means that you need to support the local population over several years with food, with cash, so they can actually work on their own land. And then much of it, like always, is social engineering. You need to talk to people, you need to form the groups, you need to find the consensus. Often you need to bring people from one village to another village so they can see that it works. Because, this is very hard work, and you need to do that trusting that it pays off over the years.
And tell us a bit more about this project in particular. So how does it develop? You are approached by a community there, or you identified on your own initiative that this region may be in need, and then how does the process run?
I mean, typically it starts with people being in dire need of food. So we are coming in and delivering food assistance or cash assistance if there's local markets available. But then there are programs where you basically do cash for work or food for work. So you're not only handing out donations, but you also engage with the community and say, look, we look after you, but together with you, we are organizing so that your living conditions are getting better. And this is now running for a couple of years, which is also now developing an ever-growing element of local education. So there are field schools, there are scientific institutes. There's a whole network now of Western African universities and teaching institutions teaching the methodology, training people so that young people can become trainers on this. And so it's multiplying, and it really, really works. And it works in areas, if I can say that are astonishing. And one of the areas which I find astonishing, it is fighting extremism. Mm-hmm. Because these are areas where groups like Al-Shabaab are recruiting. And we have hard evidence that in the villages where this works, there are no young people to be recruited because there is a perspective. There is a way to earn your livelihood in areas that are totally desperate. Then you will have young people joining extremist groups.
I think that's very interesting, because one of the most important things to fight extremism as well, but also criminal organization, is to give people hope for a future, that you are able to have well-being even in the context of legal choices and a life that is indeed compliant with laws and norms. So you really felt that giving hope, you really were able also to fight extremism.
Absolutely. And other things also, if there's a perspective, then girls, for example, are being married later. Mm. They have less children. They reach a higher level of education. And this is, you asked me about my motivation. This is one of the reasons I love working on this topic of food, because it's so basic that so many good things happen when you start solving the food crisis.
And it's true that I think the connections are not very immediate also for the audience, not like the relation between helping with food and fighting extremism and giving people hope, or also with climate change, politics as well. Yeah. You also think in relation to politics and, for example, populism, food plays a crucial role in the African continent?
Well, I mean, everything starts with food. If you remember the Arab Spring, the trigger that actually made it happen was an explosion in food prices. What can people do if they are starving? It's basically very simple. One, you start rebelling against the authority or against whatever it is. The second thing is you just sit there and you starve. That's not a good option. And the third thing is you move to somewhere where you believe that the situation would be better. And most of that migration is something we don't see because it's happening within the countries. It's people moving from rural areas to the capital cities. Then the capital cities promise that there is work and that there is food. Often that's not the case, and then it becomes a destabilizing factor.
I found it very interesting what you said before, that perspective also in terms of food can limit extremism. Of course, the causality is also in the other way around. So extremism or violent conflicts can have an impact on the availability of food. So it's really somehow a two-way street. And I think in Europe we live very much with the perception that we live in an era of peace, more or less. Maybe a bit less since the Ukraine conflict started, but before that very much. Yet when researching the numbers, we figured out that in the 2000s there were around 25, 30 major conflicts in the world. Today there are over 60. So how come our world sees now that much more, almost double, conflicts in the world, and how does this impact the food crises and food availabilities in the world?
Yeah, well, I start with the second bit of the question. We estimate that maybe 60% of all the reasons why we have to distribute humanitarian aid is caused by conflict. Conflict is unnecessary, it's man-made, and it's the biggest driver of food insecurity, second to none. Why we have so many conflicts is a bit beyond me. Maybe that's a consequence of a multipolar world. Maybe that is that many conflicts that were sort of frozen when you were still in the Cold War suddenly start to re-erupt. But there is also a tendency, which I find very worrying, that the respect for international law and for international humanitarian law is degrading. So it's not only that conflict is happening more than before, but it becomes more difficult to deliver humanitarian aid. On the one side, getting the money for humanitarian aid, which is a big topic these days, unfortunately, but also we see that more and more humanitarian workers become a target themselves, and humanitarian convoys clearly marked as humanitarian aid are suddenly being attacked, and people somehow believe they can get away with it, or that it would even be okay, all the way to, really using hunger as a weapon of war, which is clearly against international humanitarian law, and there is even a recent Security Council resolution against it. So it's very, very worrying, and a major source of food insecurity on the planet.
I'm wondering because I think in the mainstream discourse we often say or we associate this breakdown of the international liberal order and acceptance of international law with with the rise of people like President Trump, with President Putin now attacking Ukraine. But I'm wondering, for you as a bit more a seasoned diplomat, did you observe this trend already earlier, that there is less acceptance of international law, or is it for you also a very, very recent development?
I think we have seen cracks in the system many years back. And if you boil it down, I think the main challenge is that everything we believe in basically builds on two documents: the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in my entire career, that was always, the ground on which we were all standing, not being debated. And you hear more and more, this being challenged, that these values are not universal, that the Charter is, flexible and all of that. And that's really, really worrying. You see more and more countries openly challenging concepts of human rights. Think about women's rights, for example. It's a slippery slope, but that's the only thing I can say here.
Yeah, and considering the future of the UN politically, what future do you see? Because also considering the conflict in Gaza, the conflict in Ukraine, in the mainstream discourse as well, it's seen that the UN is less effective in having a role, for example, in bringing peace to these conflicts and in geopolitical context in general. Also considering the emerging role of China in Africa, what future do you see for the UN as a political institution?
Well, if I can use an image, the UN is a club, and the members are the sovereign countries. And like any club, you can only be as good as your members are. So the UN is an offering, it's a conference table, it's a venue, it's a place where people can meet and discuss. Whether this is being taken on or not is a different question. I mean, in terms of institution, everything you need is there. I was involved almost 20 years ago in 2007 when the Human Rights Council was built. Often criticized, but I know from its constitution, from its charter, because I helped building it, that everything you need is there. The question is, do you find the political majority? Are countries engaging with the United Nations? Do they believe that the solution to problems are in multilateral diplomacy, or is it by my country first and everything I need is done in bilateral negotiations? That's a basic question. And, I would argue we need these multilateral solutions finding, because every civilization starts by listening to the weak ones. not exerting your power just because you can, controlling yourself, trying to bring as many people as possible in. If you remember the, Sustainable Development Goals, always had this subtitle, leaving no one behind. And that is what you get if the UN is not working, that those people who are left behind have no chance to actually come to the mainstream.
Because indeed, what I'm also seeing is that culturally there has been also a shift to this power politics of strength, for example, in the US administration with Trump, and now also with, for example, the invasion of Ukraine, Netanyahu in Gaza. So I think also culturally, do you also see that we are a bit missing this value of not leaving anyone behind?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, you also see it in declining numbers when it comes to humanitarian aid and development cooperation. But there is always, and learning from history, you can be in your time the strongest power by far, but power alone is not creating the stability. And every empire crumbles if it only relates on power. You need the hard power, maybe, but you definitely need the soft power. You need things like being accepted in the world, like having friends in the world. And it's lonely out there when you have all of the world against you. And ultimately, you cannot stand alone. This planet is too small for just one player to run all of the game.
No, and I also think that, history repeats itself in the sense that we are seeing again, this trend coming back after several decades. For example, also after the Second World War, we are seeing again coming back to this politics of strength, of isolationism. And in your daily work, do you see the impact of the Trump administration leaving this concept of soft power and not focusing as before on humanitarian aid?
I think it would be simplistic just to look in this direction. I mean, look at the World Food Programme. The United States continue to be our largest contributor. We have a global trend, and that is true for Europe as well, that the numbers of support means that we have to do our work are sharply reduced. And there seems to be a fatigue with international assistance for whatever reasons, and that's a global crisis. So you cannot just finger point in one direction. This is also, and this is a European podcast, something where we need to look in the mirror and say, hey, this is also happening with us.
And I'm one. This may be a bit of a delicate question, but since we're talking about dynamics within the UN, and you saying that it's not only the US who follows this certain trend, but also other states, do you feel that within the UN structures there has been a shift between going from a spirit of compromise and coordination more towards a purely power politics kind of negotiation? Because of course the UN is funded by its members, and with funding comes power. And so I'm wondering to which degree member states show their power within the organization.
I can't state that, because the UN is all about compromise. It's all about negotiation. Sometimes painful with endless night sessions, but if it works, just beautiful. The question is, to what extent are member states ready to support this platform, to use this platform for the issues they have to negotiate? So the UN itself is just a follower of the political reality. But what the UN stands for is very clearly out there with the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the other instruments that have been built over many decades, which I think is an incredible success story. But it is up to the member states to keep that alive.
Yeah, and one of the big files which have also been discussed in the previous years, also in the framework of the Conference of the Parties, so of the COPs, is the one of climate finance towards the global south. And of course, it's quite clear that the global north has emitted much more carbon, is therefore mainly to blame or is mainly responsible for climate change. now global south countries have often argued that therefore we have some form of responsibility to help them in their decarbonization efforts. I'm wondering how you see this and how you see the developments in the last years, including announcement that some financing will go to the global south.
It's a complicated question if you come a little bit closer, because when the whole UN climate negotiation process started, so Earth Summit in Rio 92, and then the first conference of the parties here in Berlin in 95, actually with Angela Merkel as the first COP president, and all of this process. So as it started in 95, historical emissions were huge, and the claim to say you caused the problem with your historical emissions, you got to pay for it, I think was very justified. But the world has really shifted, and if you look at the major sources of emissions today, it's different. So you can't only look back at the historic emissions, you also need to take into consideration that we are emitting every single year more carbon than we have ever done before. And so only looking at the historical emissions is not the full picture. Having said that, countries who had historically emitted a lot of greenhouse gas, like Germany, for example, have stepped up substantially and paid billions into instruments like the Green Climate Fund. There, in return, you need to check and double check how much of this money is actually going to least developed countries. And there I see a little bit of a vicious circle, that you have countries that have very weak institutions, governance issues, all of that make it difficult for these countries to actually get the carbon money. But typically, many of these countries are the climate most vulnerable countries. And that is a conundrum which we need to solve, for questions of fairness, climate justice, those who contributed least suffering most, that's something we need to correct very clearly, but also for questions of effectiveness of the usage of this money. We spoke about this land restoration project, not least, and this is in least developed landlocked countries, not least, this is sequestering an awful lot of carbon in the soil. This is bringing back terrestrial ecosystems. This is helping balancing water cycles. And all of that is work that is, bringing a lot of local benefits, but it's also a service done to humanity. And there need to be money for this.
And I also think in terms of communication of impacts, what you mentioned, for example, is just amazing, but it's something that, for example, both of us, we did not know. And do you think in mainstream media, the UN is a bit undervalued in the sense that there is not that much common conception of how much well-being did it bring to the world?
There are so many misconceptions. The Brookings Institute in the US since many years is running polls, and over many years, when being asked, an average American person would estimate that 25% of American GDP is paid in foreign aid. 25%. And then if you ask the second question, okay, so how much do you think would be fair? The answer typically is 1%. And we would be happy if countries worldwide would pay 1% for development. Yeah. So there's wild misconceptions out there about how much money is being mobilized, where this money goes, and how it's being used, X million children vaccinated who don't suffer from polio. Famines averted that you never heard of because it's only the bad news that make it. Instruments, normative instruments like the UN Convention for People with Disabilities, really bringing us to a next level of civilization. All of that is the UN, and so much more, international air traffic, sharing of weather data so you can get accurate forecasts. People don't associate these progresses with the United Nations. So seems to be a big communication issue here.
Do you think that this could be improved by the UN itself, or is it more a question of the members of the UN not communicating properly about the UN's impact?
Oh, I think finger pointing doesn't help here, but it is, sometimes the good things that we have are taken for granted and people focus on the issues there are. Everyone enjoys during the holidays to see a UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site because they are beautiful and they are protected, and nobody thinks about this is also UN.
And here I also think because media are also driven a lot by negativity, there is a negativity bias in the sense that you get more attention by providing negative views or a negative indeed narrative about something. And I think this also applies to the UN, but also to other institutions like the EU itself, for example. And also on climate change, there are some striking facts that indeed the reality of scientific consensus on climate change is like more than 99.9% of scientists, but the general population believes that there is not such a level of consensus. So do you think there is also I don't know to say like that mass media are also responsible of this, for example, lack of trust towards the UN?
Well, mass media, it's like private sector. It's these terms where you don't really know whom you're talking about. If you say the Guardian is mass media, they are doing exemplary work in enlightening people about climate change. But what it really is we are not having an innocent conversation about climate change. We've been seeing for many, many years mighty, powerful organizations using public relation agencies to frame the whole debate. People don't want to hear so much about climate change because of their own individual carbon footprint. What does that do? You guys, you came from Brussels, so you should feel guilty because you did something bad on your carbon footprint. But that whole framing of individual responsibility is something that comes from the oil industry. So, the longer I am in this political business, the more I would actually say that the beef in a conversation is often not in the conversation itself, but in the tacit assumptions. If the things that people don't question, the framing of the discussion, and if you look closer to that framing, then suddenly you're opening that. In your opening remarks, you said we have enough food for 10 billion people. Many people would say quite the contrary. They would say, oh gosh, soon we will be 10 billion people. How on earth can we feed 10 billion people? Well, we need to produce more come hell or high water. Completely wrong, but you would not believe how many people would actually buy that narrative. So it's the need to go a level down and really think about what are my assumptions in this discussion.
Yeah. But I also think that one of the problem is that also you did well indeed in distinguishing mass media not as a general one single entity, but it's also true that I believe that also in social media, like what is false and what is true is like mixed together. So it's also, I understand that, for example, for people that are not experts, it's also easy to be misled and manipulated as well by information that you can find on the web.
Yes, and something interesting happened. When I was a kid, 15, 16 years old, which admittedly is a bit time since then, they were typically, only the public TV stations, and there was a talk show, and there was a politician from the left and a politician from the right, and then came the professor. And the professor then said, it's like that, and the discussion was over, because there was the authority of academia, right? And today, we have in climate, IPCC alone is more than 3,000 scientists, and by far not every scientist is a member of IPCC, but we have a scientific consensus which is unbelievable. If you ever work with scientists, 3 scientists have 5 opinions, and here you got more than 3,000 declaring in unison, it is real, it is happening, it is frightening, it is accelerating, and people just shrug it off and say, user Mike 2002 says the contrary, and you don't even know who that person is, but suddenly that person has the same weight like an internationally acknowledged climatologist, which is insane, but it happened slowly, and now the authority of science seems to be undermined in its totality.
Indeed, like what I find, in my opinion, a bit crazy is that, for example, the president of the United States, but also other presidents, that is not needed to mention, they claim, indeed, for example, in the past, they also claim that climate change is not real, and the fact that you can mention, for example, one source out of 1,000 that discard the evidence of scientists is also extremely dangerous, in my opinion. So, in your opinion, what could be a solution to that? Because, you mentioned just the facts that support your view and your interest. Do you think it's this where it will lead us?
Well, specifically on climate, I think we need, and that is very difficult, we need to depoliticize the climate argument, because we are dealing with natural science. And you're not debating the weather forecast for tomorrow. When it says heavy rains, you will leave the house with an umbrella and you come prepared. So if we would manage to go back to the local communities and say, no matter whether you're left or right or where you stand politically, what do you witness? And then, the farmers would tell you, we have one dry spell after another. If you have a landowner has a forest thing, we have, all sorts of pests in the forest because it's too dry. City dwellers would tell you we've never seen such extreme rainfalls, and the city planners would say our infrastructure is not built for that. All of this is a fact. So can we not go back where we live, how we live, with the people we live with, and say, so what are we experiencing? Notwithstanding any sort of propaganda, but what's the reality? And I remember not so long ago, I sat next to an old man in a restaurant and he was asking me what I was doing. And at that time, I was with the Climate Change Secretariat. And I thought, should I tell him what I'm doing? Because I just wanted to enjoy my food. And then I said, yes, I work on climate change. And he said, you don't need to tell me about climate change. And I thought, oh gosh, here we go again. And he said, I'm a beekeeper since I'm a 15-year-old boy, and every year I'm keeping my reports, and you don't need to convince me because I see it right there, how it's changing every year. And I think that's a beautiful example for how you go away with this, finger pointing and politicization to, there's a problem, let's fix it.
Yeah, and I think it's, I agree that that's a good different perspective to look at it. I think, at least for the climate change perspective, the standard narrative is to look at it very much from a geopolitical perspective, and it's clear that from a perspective of countries, there are implications with the clean tech developments, drive away from fossil fuels. I think to bring the conversation a bit back to the food topic, what's less clear for me personally is to which degree food security also has a geopolitical implication. So to which degree countries view food as a tool in geopolitics or not?
I think we haven't paid attention to food for a long time. And the first true wake-up call was COVID. Because suddenly there was stuttering in the supply chains. Not disruption, but really stuttering. Suddenly there were things not available. For us Westerners, that was a new experience. You go to a supermarket and the shelf is empty. That didn't happen before. And then suddenly you see how things are interdependent. And then when the Ukraine war started, of course we were expecting repercussions in the Middle East, North Africa region. If you look at the map, it's obvious that grain exports from Ukraine go in the Middle East to Egypt and other countries. But we've seen the whole system sort of shaken up all the way to Latin America, all the way to South Africa. And then you start understanding to what extent we are in a global network of trading of food. And, that is because of comparative advantages, of cheaper prices, of a high degree of commodization of our food system. Mind you, 60% of the global calories come from 4 different crops. That's very narrow compared to the at least 7,500 different crops that you could eat, that most of you have never heard the names, me included. But that also has shown the vulnerabilities. And if you add to that these 4 crops are mostly produced in rain-fed agriculture, and then you see how climate change is impacting the rainfall patterns, how you have longer extended droughts and then suddenly extreme rainfall, or more benign, you just have rainfall at a time when it's unusual, and the farmers would count on this being a dry period and it's not, and then you put the seeds out and you wait for the rain and the rain is not coming. All of that will have an impact.
And I think combined with the fact that I think the US, China and Brazil are, if I'm well informed, the largest producers or exporters of grain and of food in general.
Russia and Ukraine
and
also.
Russia and Ukraine as well. Do you feel that this is a problem that so few, relatively few countries are such big players, or is that in the nature of things?
Well, it's a curse and a blessing. It's a blessing because, of course, you can, in these countries, produce large amounts of grain for very competitive prices. And I'm by no way anti-trade, because trade is one of the main instruments to lift people out of poverty. The downside of it is, if there is a crisis hitting and you suddenly have a spike in global commodity prices, people simply don't know how to pay that. And that's one bit. And I want to open a bit for the discussion that we didn't speak about, which is nutrition. People don't only need calories to live, they need a balanced diet. And while it sounds like a luxury problem, it is not, particularly for little children. It's absolutely vital that they have the right nutrition in the first 1,000 days. And so depending only on imported staple crops is also bad for the nutrition, it's bad for the ecological systems, and it's bad for the resilience of these countries. If inflation goes through the roof and you got a big vegetable garden and you can feed yourself and your family from that garden, you couldn't care less about inflation, because your tomatoes are your tomatoes and that's the end of it. So that vulnerability to global developments is higher, and nutrition is a big issue if you only live on imported food.
And indeed, like you mentioned, a very interesting point that in the first 1,000 days, if you have situation of malnutrition, also you consider the population of an entire country, if there is a situation of malnutrition in the first 1,000 days, you risk also to raise a generation that will have long-term impact from a health perspective, and this has also an impact on the economy, on trade. And I think here there is also a lack of education also on what a good diet is, but also in the West, I would say. Do you see also in Europe this, and what could be the impact, like if European citizens are more aware of what an healthy diet is, like also from a mental health perspective, economy perspective, if you could estimate?
Well, in Europe it's a bit of a different problem, because much of the super cheap food is highly processed food, and many stressed people would buy a ready-made meal and all of that. So we are losing, I think, a little bit the knowledge of how to cook, how to prepare your food, how to select, how to even buy food, and understand that the shiny apple might be looking good, but it might not be as good in taste and in value like that apple that maybe looks a little bit less shiny. So there's a big educational issue there. There is also a possibility, and food poverty is something that you also find in Europe or the United States. Many parts of our societies actually cannot afford a good healthy diet, but then again you see trends in urban centers which sounded a little bit like last century coming back. And suddenly people go into urban gardening. They find satisfaction in growing their own vegetable. And that is, of course, not only a beautiful hobby, but it's a very cheap source of excellent food.
Yeah, I think it can be also life-changing, like to have a change in your diet, having a more nutritious diet can really change your life. Like maybe it's not an overstatement. I would say that really in the long run can really change the existence of a person.
A surprising element of it is, and if people ask me, what can I do to fight climate change? What can I do also nutrition? I would always say invite your friends for dinner, because we live in a situation in which most people eat bad food all alone, being depressed, watching Netflix. And it's just so much nicer to buy food for a couple of people and cook together and share a good meal. And that's not complicated to do. And if your pasta is not 100% perfect, well, your friends will forgive you. But that's also a question of, social interaction. And, if you look at polls, mental health polls, and how many, even young people, feel lonely, and there is just something fundamentally wrong here.
Maybe we should develop our podcast gardening project.
Yes. But it's true, because, for example, I don't know, also in Italy, for example, like food has also a cultural value and societal value, like to be together eating food is also something that really brings happiness as well.
Yeah, it can also bring you in extreme danger. If you ask ananas on your pizza, you better run.
I lived a couple of months with some South Italian.
Yes. Don't put ananas on pizza. No? Yeah.
But I wanted to just come back to something you said before, because I'm not sure if I fully grasped the implications. So you said that it has advantages that some countries rely on cheap export for some grain or wheat, but at the same time it may come with a consequence that the diet is less balanced. So I'm if I understood this correctly, I'm wondering what in a policy perspective, what the way forward should be. Should it be to incentivize countries to rely more on their own food production, at least for a part of their nutrition, to have more balance, and to only rely on imports for a smaller proportion? Or
it's not black and white, autarky, that a country is producing everything it needs itself, is madness. That's just not working. If you're Egypt, you need to import food. There's just not enough space. But one beautiful working model is Europe. We have a lot of trading within Europe, and if you're in the Netherlands or in Belgium or in Germany, your fruit, your vegetables are likely to come from the Netherlands, from Spain, from Italy. So we do a lot of regional trading, and that is, for example, something that is very underdeveloped on the African continent. So you got African countries very much depending on the world market, but way too little trading going on between African countries. So there is a big business opportunity, there is a big growth opportunity, and it would also improve diets if you just open up the field where you can get sources of your food.
And here again, we're back at the topic of infrastructure, no? Because in the end, I guess the difficulty of trading within Africa has also to do with maybe the non-availability of the necessary infrastructure.
Infrastructure, sometimes bureaucracy. It's, if you think back to the many decades of the European Union, often it is so detailed and cumbersome that you say, well, my cucumber is safe for consumers. Now you cross the border and suddenly somebody says, no, it's not safe for consumption for my consumers. So you need to harmonize, you need to deregulate sometimes, you need to ensure that, border controls, for example, tax inspections, if they are happening, at least they're happening swiftly. Because if you got a truck with fresh vegetables standing in the sun for 2 days, then it's over. You can basically just throw it away. And these kind of obstacles, there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
And I also think that indeed there, are these details that usually are bureaucratic and related to regulation that can make a huge impact. For example, harmonizing the standards of food security and what is safe can really lead to trade and an impact on population that you just see tangibly in the long run. But in Africa, for example, is what interests me. There are many differences in terms of what is considered like safe food. For example, you mentioned the cucumber, cucumber, I don't know, but are there many differences in terms of food quality check?
That's a detail I can't give you, but I know from statistics that intra-African trading can be and should be developed, and it would be helping the continent, and it would be easier also to be more resilient. It's like the internet. If one server is down, there is another server that captures it. And in your trading system, only relying on one source is always a high-risk strategy.
And do you know perhaps if there are efforts being carried out in this direction, so towards more intra-African trade? And is the UN involved?
Yeah, they are definitely. I mean, there's the African Union, there are regional networks, but it all takes time. And you need this domestic production, and you also need a validation of local production. And there is also a youth and mindset issue, because what you see in Africa is also what we have seen in Europe, that the profession of being a farmer is seen as something that is not attractive, that's backwards, that is not connected to the city. So it would be very hard, as a young man, to find a woman you can marry who would stay with you, who wants to live in the countryside. Well, in highly developed places, people would actually go back and say, why would I live in the big city? And it's just noise and dirt and everything is just incredibly cumbersome. I want to go back to the countryside. So that's also a big issue, because globally, you see that the farmer population is really aging, and that's a big topic.
Coming back to the topic of African intra-trade, like just very briefly, do you think there are also some political interests that are strong in avoiding that the African intra-trade will increase in the future? Because a more connected African continent also means a more powerful and possibly autonomous set of countries.
I wouldn't see that. I think there is more of a tradition over the last decades where, the logic was, if I put it very simply, produce what you can produce and sell to the world. So cotton, cacao, coffee, flowers. Many of our flowers come from Africa, and you get good money, and don't worry about the food production because you can import from the world market for cheap. And that is not so well working anymore, because commodity prices are high. It's not that cheap anymore to buy on the world market. Since COVID, since the Ukraine war, we have seen jumping of commodity prices, and it never really has fully come back. So it is more expensive. We have also, not to forget, the debt crisis of many African countries, where the interest rates have been going up. And every private person that has a debt somewhere has seen that, how this is going up. And so if you need to spend more money for the interest of your debts, there is less money available to buy on the world market. And then you have a domestic inflation, and if you're a doctor or lawyer or nurse and you depend on the public salary, then suddenly you get less buying power for that. And if you need to change your local currency into US dollars in order to buy on the world market, there's also the fading value of your currency. And if you take all of that together, it has just become very expensive for many countries to get those commodities from the world market.
And I think you just replied to a question that we had, because, for example, commodity food prices increased by around 30% in low-income countries, while globally and in high-income countries, 13%. So you also explain now very well this difference, why in low-income countries food prices are increasing more than in the...
The tragic thing is, if you are poor, everything for you is more expensive than if you are rich. So you are punished twice, and that's exactly what you see there.
Well, in the end, it's a tax inflation. It's a regressive sort of taxation, I will say. And it's all very interesting, I will say. But also, one point that I would like to mention is that also while we were studying for this episode, we noticed and we did some research on the fact that we have around 4 companies, 3 based in the US and 1 in the Netherlands, that they own, maybe we are wrong, like the food production of grain of about 50-60%. So first of all, do you think that how did we reach this situation of oligopoly in food production of grain, and what are the consequences?
Well, I think what we have seen is what I said earlier, the commodization of food. It is very simple to trade when something is compatible and comparable. You could argue wheat is wheat is wheat if there is a certain level of protein, and that makes it a tradable commodity. And this is what we are seeing. And again, for the better and for the worse. For the better, because, if you have the money all over the planet, you can buy stuff. I would argue that what we need to do is diversify the sources of our food, not only for our own benefit, for health and for more balanced diet, but also for nature benefit. And also to build climate resilience, because large monocultures, large monocropping is just extremely vulnerable to changes in weather pattern. It's also extremely vulnerable to pests. And that super highly developed production methods are also not adopted and adjusted to many African realities, where you have small fields, where you have hot and dry climates. So you need a very diverse cropping system to be even successful in these countries.
And I also think that one other factor that is important is also culturally, from a Western perspective. I think also food with consumerism also became a status symbol. Also wasting food is also like a kind of symbol of well-being, economic well-being. So how impactful would it be if there will not be waste of food, for example, in the Western world, if you just consume the food that you need and you don't waste food resources?
Very much so. And also, usage of food. 60% of grains being used in Germany are not consumed by humans. This is actually fodder for animals. Now, nothing against animal agriculture, but there is a big difference whether you have your cows standing somewhere on the field and being naturally fed, or if you have 5,000 animals in a stable and you feed them with grains that typically you also have imported. So I think we need to look a little bit closer again into the production methods and the benefits and the costs of it.
We had one more curiosity, and then we're towards the end of the episode. I remember in 2022, after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, there were many discussions also in the European Parliament on the fact that food prices were increasing, and one of the main arguments which differentiated the left and the right was that the left often described this as a consequence of financial market speculation, and indeed we saw that some prices of food, the futures, increased by around 30%. I was wondering, and we were wondering, how you see this debate. Is financial market speculation actually something which contributes to artificially increased food prices, or not really?
I think to a much lesser extent than one would think. Yes, I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we've seen an extreme spike in food prices, but this is to be expected. I mean, if you have an attack on the fifth largest producer on wheat, that the stock exchanges are reacting hysterical is something that I think is foreseeable. There are voices who say there shouldn't be any speculation in food. If you are a big producer, let's say a big miller or a big bakery chain, you need to have these futures in order to make your buying foreseeable. If that is related then to too high prices is a question. There are people who would actually say, yes, let's have a futures market, but related to people actually needing then to buy and to take the stuff, so that you avoid the abstract speculation, but you still allow the futures market for producers to secure themselves. Maybe that's a way to go.
And do you think this is achievable, realistically, to take out the abstract speculation? Because I also see that in the world of finance, abstract speculation has a very big share of in general speculation. Do you think that this is something that could be achievable, this solution that you just mentioned?
It's a good question. I believe there was a similar model once with aluminium that for some reason became an issue of massive speculation until there was regulation, I believe, in the US that, if you buy futures of aluminium, you cannot trade them further, but you need to actually get it. And I think if you have once a bank that's flooded by aluminium, you won't do that again.
Probably. And no, since indeed the podcast is moving Europe, I also would like to touch upon one fact that we already touched a bit, but that 1 out of 10 Europeans struggle to have a meal every second day. And this is something that for me is a bit astonishing to think that in our continent this is happening. And in your opinion, we work for the European Commission. Did you see that enough has been done in this regard in terms of fighting food poverty within the European Union? Because it's even more astonishing for me that is such a developed economy like the EU, while still 1 out of 10 struggle to get enough food.
Yeah, I think for a long time we were almost spoiled in Europe because food prices were really low. And over the last years, they have been exploding. And I think the political reaction is yet to come. We see certain movements, lower taxes on food, for example. But in general, I think it needs a recalibration because the social costs of not having decent meals are just gigantic. You see food banks now booming in places like the UK. Well, the UK decided to leave the European Union, but at least in my perspective, it's still Europe. It's very hard to say, and sometimes even me as a consumer, I'm flabbergasted by the prices of simple things like bread or vegetables. And maybe a bit of that is also that there was just an opportune moment to ask for really hefty prices when you had the justification for that. So yeah, it is a difficult topic.
Thanks a lot, Martin. And maybe to wrap it up, when you look at everything we discussed until now and take into account all your professional experience, at the moment, what is it in the geopolitics of food and food security in the world that worries you the most, and what gives you hope?
Well, what worries me the most is really the simplification of food. Food is diversity, and place like Italy, you go from one region to another region and the food changes. The pasta is different, the grains is different. There is a whole richness to that. And for me, the motto really is diversify, diversify, diversify. It's going back to your indigenous foods, it's going back to the tradition. Maybe it's also looking over the fence to your neighbor because the climate is changing, what food you could have that. And it all boils down to paying a bit more attention to food, showing more appreciation to food, and often for those consumers who can actually afford it, spend a little bit more money on food, because it makes a world of a difference for the producers, and it makes a world of a difference for your own health and also for the enjoyment of food. And we shouldn't forget that, it's the most enjoyable thing, as I said, to sit with friends and to enjoy a good meal.
That's actually a very good closing remark, because I think one of the key takeaway of the episode for me is that food has several spillovers. No, food is politics, geopolitics, can be international relations, can be mental health, can be psychology, can be socialization. No, so I think it's like to just consider food as something that you just eat, I think is very reductionist, no? So I think that's a good for the audience. And if you indeed so one suggestion for the EU audience, since indeed we are moving Europe, is to be more careful to food, to give more value to food.
Yes, and invest a little thought, ask questions. Where is that meat coming from? How are these tomatoes grown? Is that something I really want? And if I'm in a hurry, do I really need a ready-made meal, or should it be a basic quality of my life that I take my time and I look into what I'm eating and what I better don't touch.
I think it was a very cool episode, so
Thanks a lot, Martin.
really.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Don't put pineapple on pizza.